First, we get the Justice Department under Merrick Garland advising Trump's last attorney general and his last deputy attorney general and other senior officials from Trump's last days that they are, in fact, allowed to testify to Congress for Congress's ongoing investigations into how Trump tried to overturn the election results and stay in power. So the Justice Department okayed former Trump officials testifying to the congressional investigations of those matters. Then the Justice Department handed over to those congressional investigations. The Oversight Committee in the House, the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, handed over to them a bunch of documents from the Justice Department from that time period. Those documents include notes from the Trump Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue from a call on December 27th. These notes showing Trump complaining in that call that there must have been fraud everywhere in the election, and the Justice Department should do more to promote and legitimate his claims of fraud. The notes say President Trump told the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General in that call, quote, "Just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." And that obviously landed as a bombshell and got a ton of attention over the past couple of weeks since those notes were first released to the public by the House Oversight Committee. But here's the other part of those handwritten notes that made me basically swallow my tongue when I printed out the whole set of notes on vacation and read them. It's just a single line on page 4 of these handwritten notes. This is apparently, again, quoting Trump. Most of these notes are just quoting Trump on this call. And according to the notes, Trump says in this call on December 27th, says to senior Justice Department officials, the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General, he says to them, quote, "Georgia legislature is on our side." The reason that is so bad, that single line is such a doozy, is because of what we now know happened the very next day. By the very next day, December 28th, we now know, an apparently very Trumpy senior figure at the Trump Justice Department, a man who ran the civil division of the Justice Department, a man named Jeff Clark, drafted this letter that was to be sent to the governor of Georgia, the head of the state assembly there, and the head of the state senate there. "Dear Governor Kemp, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. President Pro Tem, quote, the Department of Justice is investigating various irregularities in the 2020 election for President of the United States. The department will update you as we are able on investigatory progress. But at this time, we have identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states, including the state of Georgia." The next paragraph of the letter is him then linking to the moonbat Rudy Giuliani fake hearing in Georgia in December. That was so bonkers, it ultimately contributed to Rudy Giuliani having his license to practice law suspended in multiple jurisdictions. But that's what Jeff Clark cites as the evidence for these terrible revelations of corruption in Georgia. Jeff Clark's letter continues, quote, "In light of these developments, the department," meaning the U.S. Department of Justice, "recommends that the Georgia General Assembly should convene in special session to take additional testimony, receive new evidence, and deliberate on this matter. The purpose of the special session, the department recommends, would be for the Assembly to evaluate the irregularities in the 2020 election, determine whether those violations show which candidate for president won the most legal votes in the election, and number 3, to determine whether the election failed to make a proper and valid choice between the candidates, such that the General Assembly could take whatever action is necessary to ensure that one of the slates of electors cast by the state will be accepted by Congress on January 6th. So again, this is a letter to Georgia dated December 28th. This is Jeff Clark, head of the Civil Division in Trump's Justice Department, writing this letter, essentially telling the state legislature in Georgia that they should consider the election corrupt because the Justice Department has looked into it and found all sorts of significant corruption. And therefore, the state legislature should take matters into their own hands to replace the state's Biden electors with Trump electors and do it before January 6th when the Electoral College votes would be counted. In the letter, Jeff Clark even spells out that although it looks on the surface like only the governor of Georgia could call the legislature back into such a special session like this, he says it is the opinion of the U.S. Department of Justice that the legislature can call itself back into session, even without the governor doing anything. They can do that on their own authority. And remember the note. Remember that line on page 4 from the call that happened the previous day. Trump assuring the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General, quote, "The Georgia legislature is on our side." So the problem here, the problem that emerges, how dare this happened on my vacation? The problem that emerges is that this wasn't some cockamamie fantasy where, like, the pillow company guy says the whole Supreme Court will rule 9-0 that Trump is the Lord Emperor, right? This isn't like the QAnon cyber ninjas in Arizona being like, we found bamboo shoots in the bathroom trash, and therefore Biden magically isn't president anymore. This isn't some of that nonsense like we have seen in the months since the election from the president's supporters and people working for him. This is an actual plan, right? The letter has places for 3 signatures at the bottom. The Attorney General, Jeff Rosen at the time, Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donoghue at the time, and the guy who wrote it, Jeff Clark, the head of the Civil Division at the time. Had Rosen and Donoghue agreed with Clark that they should sign this and send it, think about what that would have meant. There, of course, would have been a national clamor that the U.S. Justice Department had declared the election to be corrupted, potentially fatally so. The Georgia Republican legislature, if Trump was right, if Trump was right that they were on board with this, they're on our side, and if he was right, they would have tried to call themselves into special session to what? Try to recall the state's Biden electors from the Electoral College. Instead, consider whether the other slate, meaning the Trump slate, should have been sent instead. So Jeff Clark sent over this draft letter dated December 28th. He also sent over an email accompanying the letter to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. In that email, he spelled out exactly that the plan was to do this not just in Georgia, but in multiple states. It says, quote, "The concept is to send it to the governor, speaker, and president pro temp," he says temp, it should be president pro tem, "of each relevant state, to indicate that in light of time urgency and sworn evidence of election irregularities presented to courts and legislative committees, the legislatures thereof should each assemble and make a decision about elector appointment in light of their deliberations." So they're gonna send this thing to Georgia, saying the Justice Department has found serious irregularities. You all should convene yourselves in a special session and look at your slate of electors. Know what I mean? They're going to send this thing to Georgia. They believe Republicans in the Georgia legislature are on our side and will act on it, will actually do it. They'll replace the election result in Georgia with their own choice of Trump electors. And they plan to do the same thing in multiple other states where, again, they think Republican legislators will act. And, of course, they'd be much more likely to do that if Georgia went ahead first, especially if they had this backstop from the U.S. Justice Department talking about all this fraud in the election, and that could be used to justify their actions. So it would be Georgia first, but then presumably it'd be Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona and Wisconsin and Nevada, everywhere they believed that Republicans in control of the state legislature would go for it. If Georgia went first and did it, would Republican state legislators in those other states do it too? If they had backup from the U.S. Justice Department, if they had this explicit pretext, this explicit request from the U.S. Justice Department that they should do it? You think they wouldn't? I mean, this wasn't a fantasy. This was an actual plan, an actual thing that they tried. And for one, it solves an actual mystery, a thing that has been bugging me since January. Just before the attack on the Capitol obliterated all other news on January 6th, we learned that the top federal prosecutor in Georgia, so effectively the top DOJ official in the state of Georgia, had suddenly resigned his position. So the U.S. Attorney in Georgia, his name was B.J. Pack. We covered it intensively at the time. Why is B.J. Pack resigning? Particularly when it emerged that Trump had been calling election officials in Georgia, personally pressuring them to declare the election a fraud. Why did the U.S. Attorney in Georgia resign in the middle of that kind of pressure from the president? Well, as Katie Benner at the New York Times reported while I was trying to teach myself new fishing knots, that U.S. Attorney in Georgia, B.J. Pack, he was reportedly told about this plot from Trump and Jeff Clark at the Justice Department. He was told about the plot that they were trying to launch starting in Georgia. As the top Justice Department official in Georgia, U.S. Attorney B.J. Pack, a Trump appointee, would presumably have had to go along with that or get out of the way, right? I mean, the plot underway that Trump was working on with a senior Justice Department official who he then tried to install as Attorney General. What he was working on was to have the Justice Department declare Georgia's elections to be corrupt and then tell Republicans in the legislature to go ahead and convene themselves and declare Trump the winner, to pick a Trump electoral slate to replace the Biden slate. The U.S. attorney in Georgia, B.J. Pack at the time, would have had to back that up as a Justice Department official, or he would have had to quit and get out of the way. Well, we now know after he got a call from the Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donoghue, late on the night of January 3rd, he quit early in the morning of January 4th. And we now know that that Deputy Attorney General, Rich Donoghue, and the Attorney General, Jeff Rosen, they didn't sign their names on the bottom of that letter to Georgia in the space that had been left for them to sign. And it looks like that Deputy Attorney General, Rich Donoghue, warned the U.S. Attorney in Georgia about this plot, this actually rational, conceivable plot to overturn the election using fake fraud claims in Georgia, backed up by the U.S. Justice Department and backed up and effectuated by Republicans in the legislature of those states who would be willing to go along with it.